Welcome to Starving for Darkness, a podcast about the power of natural darkness for all living things. I'm your host, Jane Slade, an expert in the healing benefits of the night. We are living in an age of digital overload and runaway light pollution. Right now, over 80% of humanity can no longer see the stars. Yet natural darkness may be the perfect antidote to rescue ourselves from the drawbacks of modern life. The night is a place of untapped human potential.
Are you recording?
It is recording, but we'll be editing this out.
But why? My beard just sounds so good on the microphone. By the way, I really appreciate that you have all white hardware, considering your whole darkness stint.
Actually, a mentor of mine, she recently passed away, but one of her design tools was when in doubt, buy white.
Yeah.
Because then it just gives space for whenever you really do want to introduce color.
Absolutely.
Great. So,
do we really have to wear the headphones, though?
We could try not. I've never done that.
It feels much more intimate without it.
Okay, let's try it.
It's isn't that so much okay, we've heard our levels, now we can just talk.
Okay, so hello darkness lovers, welcome to another episode of Starving for Darkness. I'm Jane Slade, your host and advocate for natural darkness for all living things. I also believe that darkness as a source of passive meditation is a source of untapped human potential, and we will get into that in the series. But for today, I'm so excited to have Dan Weissman here. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
So Dan Weissman, you are the associate principal of Lamb Partners. You are an architect, lighting designer, researcher, and teacher. As director of Lamb Labs, you support the firm's endeavors in digital technologies, daylighting design, and academic engagement, which is actually how I know you for all these years.
Well, sort of, yeah.
Yeah, connected to.
We go way back.
We do go way back, yes. Dan, you are the chair of the IES Daylighting Committee.
It is true.
You teach lighting at Harvard Graduate School of Design.
Occasionally.
And you invited me to guest teach
a
couple years ago. You're an active member of the IES Sustainable Design Committee and Solema's Climate Studio Product Advisory Group.
It is true.
Now, beyond the world of light and architecture, Dan is an avid musician and amateur luthier. Is that how you say it?
Luthier,
okay. Of mandolin family instruments.
Although not currently.
Okay. Well, one only has so much time.
Exactly.
Because you also tend a garden, along with two very active children. How old are your kids now?
7 and 9.
Wow. And you bake 2 sourdough loaves a week. That sounds delicious.
Great bio.
Great bio. And so, Dan, I wanted to start off today with asking you, do you have a story or a moment where you had an experience in natural darkness or the night that really influenced your approach to darkness or how darkness makes you feel?
Good question. Well, the one that I have two that really jump out as memories immediately. The first is from when I was in high school, and I went to summer camp in northern Wisconsin for about 10 years. And, it's relatively dark up in the North Woods in northern Wisconsin, and one night we got to see the Aurora Borealis.
Wow.
It wasn't super intense, and it was before smartphones, so you couldn't artificially see more than the human eye can see. But I remember, my camp friends running out and being like, "Oh my God, there's aliens coming!" I'm like, "No, it's the Aurora Borealis."
Aww.
And so that was very cool, and I remember that definitely had an impact. And I also, for some reason, have this memory of laying in a field with some friends in my 20s in Maine and having an incredibly clear night sky.
Yeah.
So many stars. That one was very impactful, just as like a, cosmic experience.
Yeah.
I have also visited a couple very prominent telescopes in the world, but not at night, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
I've been to the VLA, the Very Large Array in New Mexico,
Wow.
which is surrounded by a huge natural bowl of small mountain so that it's incredibly quiet. Now, they don't care so much about visible light as they do about other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum being quiet there. But that was a very impressive experience. And then I also got to visit the Arecibo Observatory before it fell apart.
Interesting.
Lady and I went on our honeymoon with some friends to Puerto Rico a decade ago. So those were both very cool experiences too. I think I've been to a couple others, but those two were like particularly impressive. And I've always had a sort of a pop interest in astronomy and the night sky and things of that nature. We bought a telescope a couple years ago.
Yeah, I think you remember you telling me that.
And we've actually had some very cool experiences just on our front street and stoop in Cambridge. Now all we can see with this is a couple of the planets and the moon. But I will tell you, if you're sitting out with a telescope in a public place and staring at Jupiter, you can get anybody walking by to come look and create wonder. It is really incredible.
That's amazing. And it's truly this shared part of humanity that we're not really taking. But I love that you bring a telescope out to the street of Cambridge and it invites everyone to kind of be a human together again.
There is something fundamentally different about seeing particularly Jupiter, Saturn, and the moon through a telescope, live, real.
Right.
What you're seeing out in the sky is not mediated through a photograph or through the internet. It is, you are seeing it with your own eyes, like the way Galileo saw it 500 years ago. It's pretty cool.
That's amazing. Now, when you were in that, in Maine, when you were looking at that clear sky, do you remember the feeling that it evoked inside of you?
I mean, I definitely had a sense of wonder and like the just vastness of the universe.
Yeah.
And I think because it was, it was a fall night, it was cool and crisp, so it was the air was particularly clear and still. And I don't think I've seen more stars than that night.
Yeah. I remember having a similar experience and actually just being scared at all that I didn't know. And it was very scary, but it stretched my imagination permanently in that way.
The thing I actually really appreciate about the night in Maine was when you're laying on the ground looking up at the night sky for long enough, you cease to feel like you are like standing on a ground surface and more that you are like on the side looking outward.
I know what you mean. Yes.
And there's something very transcendental about that.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean because it's like this is our window's view out into whatever space is. So I've actually written poems about that. It was about my parents and, parents are getting old. And I kind of wrote a poem to like take a snapshot of what the window of that night was in the stars and that we'd always have that particular night and the window of that night.
That's nice.
Yeah. So I don't think I've ever asked you this, but how did you come into design? Like what made you decide to be a designer?
Well, I've wanted to be an architect since I was a little kid, actually. I was always drawn to the built environment, to the human-built stuff. I don't know. Something about it just piqued my interest really early. Growing up in Milwaukee in the 90s, we had just gotten the art museum commission for the Calatrava edition to the Milwaukee Art Museum. And so I got to experience sort of both the comparison. Well, and just seeing this crazy piece of architecture be presented to this city that didn't have much monumentality to it. And then I got to watch it being constructed throughout my middle and high school years. And so like my dad and I would bike down and watch it under construction and like seeing this crazy formwork. And I don't know, I was like very obsessed with Calatrava in my before times. And then I went to architecture school and learned that maybe Calatrava wasn't the best example for like architecture that can do more than just be monumental, and got very into sort of the role that architecture can play in the service of making everyday people's lives better.
Yeah.
And doing all sorts of interesting things that have a social and environmental impact. And towards the end of college, I was not really sure what I was going to do with myself after. I started applying to some firms, was interested in, firms that had a bit of a sustainability stint. And this was, back in the early 2000s when that wasn't nearly as much of a discussion. I think they were on Lead 2.0 at that time. And then I sat at a awards dinner at the Distinguished Alumni Awards for the school at WashU in St. Louis, where I went to college, and Paul Zafiriou was one of the award winners, and I sat at his table just by happenstance, and at the end of the dinner he was like, "You should come work for us in Cambridge, we have bagels on Fridays."
Wow.
And I was like, I'd literally never heard of lighting design as a profession before. I was in a class called Climate and Light, and it was mostly on things having to do with daylight, which really piqued my interest. And I had sort of this intuition about daylight access throughout my college years, but didn't really have the language for it.
Sure.
And then when I met Paul, and then I came out and interviewed, and then I got hired at Lamb, I started to learn about those things and just like absorbed it like a kid in a candy store.
Do you think you would have moved to Boston if not for Lamb?
So it was not on my radar. However, my college roommate was planning to move to Boston because his dad lived out here. And so I hadn't considered it before, but is literally got off the airplane for the first time. I'd never been to Boston before. Wow. I got off the airplane, got out, took the blue line to the green line to the red line because they didn't have the silver line yet, and popped out of Charles MGH over the Longfellow Bridge. It was a beautiful June day, and I was like, I'm moving here no matter what.
Wow, that is a nice intro to Boston.
Yeah, so I came out for my interview 2 weeks after I graduated college, and 2 weeks later I was hired. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Now, you recently wrote an article that you've gotten a lot of accolade for, which is Unpacking the Wallpack.
Ah, yes.
And I do appreciate that as a darkness advocate, because we always call them glare bombs. In case you don't know what a wallpack is, it is a fixture that is placed on the outside of a building and is very often just a lens shooting out light to the surrounding area, which is basically in all directions. So it's terrible for light pollution. Now, what would you say your thesis of that article was?
Well, it sort of came about, actually, I sort of spoke to the genesis of the idea in the article, although it got pared back a little, from standing on a rooftop in New York City, in like downtown, or not downtown, midtown, on a rooftop at some lighting manufacturer's roof deck spot. And, it's like you're in the middle of the most extreme luminous environment in the world, in a way, or one of them. And yet, like, the thing that stood out the most when looking out for this roof deck was like some wall packs mounted on top of mechanical room door on some next neighboring building. It's like, what the
yeah, it's frustrating.
And I guess I've always been intuitively sensitive to glary sources in the nighttime environment, and as I started to become more aware of them as a thing that I was interested in exploring, you start seeing them everywhere.
Yeah.
And not that they weren't there before, but like they become that much more present in your field of view. And I don't go anywhere at night without seeing a couple or a lot, depending on where you are.
Yeah.
And so back to your question, the thesis
Yes.
was really trying to situate the form factor in the broader perspective of lighting typology and trying to, well, for lack of a better word, unpack it to try and give it some intellectual meaning or intellectualize its presence as a way to try and push back against its utility or ubiquity, I mean.
Yeah.
And I found it to be an interesting source of conversation starter.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like the better, faster, cheaper. And, it's not better, but it is faster and cheaper to deliver light from a wall pack.
Yeah, but I don't even buy that. Because,
well, I'm not saying I like it. I'm just saying
but
people
I guess,
choose it for that reason.
But I think it's also, there's, if we want to get into the weeds on like it as a light delivery mechanism, it is not any cheaper or more expensive to use a wall pack than it is to use let me rephrase that. Let's call it an unshielded wall pack.
Well, that is definitely what we're discussing.
Because, like, if you want a super cheap lighting hardware product to mount on an exterior wall, there are plenty of options that face that light downward that are no more expensive than lights that shine outward.
I have seen cases, though, where the dark sky version simply will not deliver enough light to make the client happy.
Yeah, but that's an issue of perception, not an issue of cost.
Sure.
Right? Like the idea that, well, and this is an issue that we're seeing throughout the realm of lighting, is the mismatch between calculated or numerical
absolutely.
Basically
foot candles versus
exactly.
perception.
So okay, yes, you can deliver a certain amount of foot candles to a surface further from a wall pack, but that externalizes a whole range of other factors that are arguably significantly more important. And it's the same issue that we see in interior office spaces where we worry about how much light is hitting the desk surface when people are working on their computers, and what we actually care about is like delivering circadian stimulus to the eye.
Yeah.
And like not giving people enough access to daylight because of a whole range of factors that we don't need to get into. So I think this is not like the issue with why, or one of the reasons why wall packs are ubiquitous is a very similar mismatch that is, issue across sort of it's the engineered quantitative approach versus the light as a perceptual device.
For sure. And to your point, I mean, if you're pumping that much light out from an unshielded wall pack, you also have glare, which is impacting perception as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if we just take out all of the light pollution and dark sky and sort of larger environmental issues, just from a purely quality of light standpoint, the unshielded wall pack does significantly more harm than it does good, because yes, great, you can the only time where it might make sense from a lighting perception standpoint is if there really is like a strong need for an observer standing behind an observer standing behind the wall pack or inside the building, looking outward, and needing to see areas flooded and with no, concept. But like, where in the urban environment is that like a major issue. Like that's basically like prisons,
Yes.
like military armories, which arguably also like that's not it. None of this is good. I'm just saying like that. Those are the types of installations where one might be able to make an argument for flooding an area with less regard for but like if you're a strip mall and you've got one row of parking between your building and the street, light the parking lot and don't light 12 blocks away because like the difference in cost there is negligible.
Yeah.
That's just bad practice.
Yeah, you're definitely trading quality of experience for metrics that don't matter.
Yeah, and frankly, I think more often than not, it's and I mentioned this in the article that like it's not nefarious like bad actors that are actively like people. I just want to blast light everywhere. It's
lack of understanding.
Yeah,
expedience.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and the ubiquity of a product type that like there are certain manufacturers who will not be named here that I think give a lot of lip service to doing good for the world, but in fact are selling products that sell without any regard for their impacts.
Yes,
and
there's a lot
I
of
think
that.
we need to take a stronger stance and call these manufacturers what they are, which are polluters.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a good segue because you're also on the IES Sustainable Design Committee. And you kind of mentioned before, like in the 2000s, there was not a lot of approach to sustainability from the design industry. I noticed that myself. So what's the Sustainability Committee doing now? And what are you excited about?
Well, I will be honest that like 15 years ago, the Sustainability Committee was trying to develop more sort of a holistic understanding of how to approach lighting design in the built environment without a lot of metric associated with it. Today, concepts of sustainable lighting design have filtered through much more of the recommended practices. There's, a couple of different committees on responsible light at night and providing appropriate lighting for outdoor environments.
Yeah.
I'm much more actively right now working on the daylighting committee, which I can mention a little bit, but the Sustainable Design Committee has actually focused its attention this time around much more specifically on the material ecology of lighting hardware and basically moving from purely thinking about operational carbon use to embodied carbon. The unfortunate reality is that based off of our energy mix and the usage versus manufacturing life cycle trade-offs, operational carbon is still significantly outweighs embodied carbon in the lighting hardware space.
Can you please explain the difference between operational carbon
of
and
course.
embodied
Sorry.
carbon?
So embodied carbon refers to all of the carbon that's employed in the construction of a light fixture, or really anything, obviously, but like we're talking about light fixtures here, where the operational carbon is the carbon use that's required for the lifetime of the fixture. So that's the way in which the electricity is sourced, as well as any need for parts to be replaced and maintenance. So, if you have to have a lift truck driving around with a gas truck driving around streets to get up on ladders and replace parts all the time, that is part of operational carbon. Mm-hmm. So if your lighting system is running off 100% renewables, your operational carbon is very, very low, which means that then your embodied carbon by percentage-wise is much higher. But if your lighting system is running off of a traditional fossil fuel-based energy mix, then your operational carbon is going to be a lot higher. Mm-hmm. So we're finishing up a document now that lays out more specific measures that both lighting designers and manufacturers can do to reduce embodied carbon, with the understanding that it's very well known how to reduce operational carbon, and that that part of the energy efficiency conversation has been part of lighting for decades now.
Yeah.
And also given between the LED revolution and the adoption and stringency of energy codes, that there's sort of only so much more that we can necessarily do relative to the technologies available on the operational carbon side. Although I would say controls is a whole huge thing, which also gets into our nighttime discussion too.
Absolutely.
So there's one of the major rooms to grow is in the embodied carbon side, and also with circular economy, and how lighting hardware has a relatively short lifespan relative to other building components.
Yeah.
And so what happens at end of life for those hardware? Are there more ways to keep the material in circulation instead of just going into landfill or whatnot? So that's the document that the Sustainable Design Committee is finishing up will have resources and direction for people to read in other parts of both the IES ecosystem and outside of it, for other parts of the sustainable design, sustainable lighting design threads, if you will. But the document is really focused in a lot on how to improve embodied carbon.
That's awesome. Yeah, I got asked that a lot, especially because when LEDs became permanently affixed within fixtures, it became a big question for specifiers. Well,
Right.
I can't change the bulb anymore, or the lamp, as we say in the industry. So that's a great question, and I never had a good answer, and that was about 10-ish years ago.
Yeah, and so funnily enough, I've had some really interesting conversations about that topic of late, because at the IALD conference, there was a presentation about the fact that we're now reaching end of life for a lot of first and second generation LED hardware.
Which I have to say I am a little happy about, because it's a foray into a dark sky approach.
Yeah, seriously. So there's sort of two ways to think about it. One is we've gotten away from the infrastructure of fixtures and lamps where regular individuals can maintain their lighting hardware for long periods of time, versus purpose-built LED systems that require a very tight marriage of source and hardware. And it's easy to say, well, every manufacturer now has their own proprietary hardware, and there's no consistency, and it's a lot harder for people to maintain and upgrade their systems over time. The flip side argument is LED-based hardware is A, significantly more energy efficient, and B, actually has a lower embodied carbon, because you're not throwing out lower quality driver and board hardware every time something fails. Like if you're using a screw-based LED light bulb, those might last, a couple of years. But if you're using an integral LED downlight, that thing might outlive the building itself if it's well constructed. Good manufacturers allow for components to be easily removed and replaced, and cheaper products are going to go to the landfill.
Yeah, it's a very interesting state of affairs to be in the lighting industry now, because we're kind of turning everything on its head, and especially with how we approach light and darkness.
An interesting thread to take from this, and you can jump in here. But so my coworker Srusti and I presented recently on a topic about the history and current status of integrated lighting. And it's a topic that we've increasingly been doing a lot of research on, and actually we might write a book, or certainly an essay, but maybe a book. We'll see. But looking at how integrated lighting went from, it was came to be at a time when electric sources were new and plentiful, and people found that they were very, very bright compared to flame-based systems, for lack of a better word, combustion.
Yeah.
But now in the age of LED, because there's so many profiles and form factors available, and the cost has gotten so cheap that people are integrating light everywhere. And so we have this.
They're integrating it in beds in hotels, which is for sleeping. Don't get me started.
Right, which I will readily admit, I worked on a hotel, and we did for a little bit have that as an as a layer. We've eaten it out. And, there's a lot of...
I mean, it's not to say that it couldn't be interesting and fun, but conceptually, it's really not in step with how we should be approaching light in our lives. By putting light integrated into beds, it's just...
There's something antithetical about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I would say that, like, a hotel room in particular, and people's bedrooms in general, are used for more than just sleeping in.
100%. Yeah.
So I wouldn't just discount it by default.
Yeah.
That being said,
but it's awkward.
Certainly, as a polemical statement, I'll certainly take it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you're seeing this in, like, the thing that really gets me, and this is now moving back to the outdoors, is like, it used to be that for most urban places, discounting the extremes like Times Square, we illuminated buildings of special significance in the urban realm. So civic buildings, religious buildings that had a significance to a community. But now everybody can light up their building exterior. So, like, the generic core and shell lab office buildings are getting all these, like, exterior lighting details. Why? What do we need to light these buildings for?
It's addictive.
It's
People
very
just
addictive.
Want to be the brightest building on the block because it draws the most attention from the biological eye. So it's very tempting.
Yeah. It's impossible for us to look away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very much a light addiction. But I remember I had a designer ask me, he was doing lighting projects in Singapore. And Singapore was like all about the lighting facades and everything like that. And he said, how could I ever explain to a client, you know, that you don't want this, you want to try and restore darkness? And the answer I gave was just that there's absolutely no facade lighting that could near compare to the clarity of a night sky.
Totally.
And that's where we're kind of getting that cheap, fast hit of light versus what would be the long-term benefit of access to starlight. So Ferdinand, my cat, has made an appearance. He probably won't jump up.
Fine.
But he might. You never know. So I actually have heard from studies that if you get a dose of daylight in the morning, it actually buffers stray bright light that you might experience at night. So you work in daylighting, and I preface with that because actually daylighting is a very important component to good darkness design in our lives.
100%.
So what have you been doing with the daylighting committee and also in all of your other approaches to daylight?
Yeah, so the daylighting committee at present is working towards a relatively rote task, which is to significantly upgrade the IES's document on lighting practice for daylighting in buildings. So in a way, it's a primer on all things daylighting design, from fundamentals of daylight and sunlight to examples of daylit architecture, methods of solar control and shading devices, glazing and window technologies and materials, and design process, ranging from the use of analytical tools, both physical and digital, and how the process can be used. Those tools can be used throughout the architectural design process actively and creatively. I would say the leading edge of daylighting research right now is in a couple different venues. One is looking at how people's access to view to the outdoors can be teased out as a separate variable from just access to raw daylight or sunlight. So imagine like sitting in a room that has a big skylight and gives you plenty of daylight from the sky dome above versus sitting in a room like where we are now, where we're looking out a window.
Yeah.
And both the sort of psychological and physiological impacts of those two things as the same or different is important. So that's one. Obviously, a huge topic of conversation right now is in the circadian stimulus, and with the discovery of the IPRGCs, the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. I finally learned that one.
Not for seeing. These are cells in your eye. They're extremely long, and they actually tie right back into the suprachiasmatic nucleus for any listeners. And essentially, these cells, they detect light, but they don't really have, their purpose isn't really for seeing. It's actually to really tie your own internal circadian system to what is happening to the outside world.
Yeah, so they're not image-forming cells, but their peak sensitivity is at about 455 nanometers, which, surprise, surprise, is similar.
Dusk and dawn?
No, sky blue.
Oh, sky blue. Oh, interesting.
So and not only that, but their density is higher in the lower half of the eye because biologically the lower half of our eye sees the sky dome more.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
There's been a major push in the last maybe decade or less for lighting manufacturers to jump on this bandwagon to basically fill in for this new deficiency. And the reality that we spend as modern day Americans and probably much of the industrialized world, upwards of 90% of our days inside, and many people are not getting enough of that stimulus to maintain our circadian systems, and they feel groggy, and there's always people pointing to productivity gains, whatever that means. I think there's both, people have an intuition about this when they don't feel great in a space.
I always feel it at conferences when you're in the hotel and you never leave and you just go into a dark seminar room.
And
it's a stark feeling.
Well, it's funny because actually I was on the planning committee for a conference back in April. And when I first got on the committee, the first thing I said is, can we not do this in a crappy hotel ballroom? And everyone was like, yeah, that's great. And we found this really great museum to do it in instead. And the room they put us in was almost worse than a hotel ballroom.
Yeah. It is honestly hard from an AV standpoint.
It is.
So I get why it ends up being like that. But then we're like literally in these like rooms meant for screens, not for humans.
Yeah. But also like I have the extreme benefit of one of the most incredible workspace environments.
I've always loved the Lamb office. It's beautiful.
And, I am incredibly privileged to be able to be in a cubicle space where I am literally looking out a window all day.
With trees.
Behind myself, behind my screens. And, I think there's this commercial industrial complex of building buildings to maximize square footage means that you end up with deeper floor plates than it allows for appropriate daylight access. So a lot of what the daylighting metrics have been trying to do over the last decade is to move the market towards, to put it very bluntly, shallower floor plates to give people more access to daylight farther into the building. And the most extreme locations for that are the places where people spend most of their time working. So offices and schools being, and healthcare spaces too. I mean, healthcare is a whole huge ball of worms, which we don't want to get into. That like the people that are working, like on the wards, like the nurses and the staff are like stuck in these spaces that have no access to daylight.
100%. I go to my doctor. You know, my doctor is very highly trained and did all this work. And then I go into the exam room, and that's where they're spending most of their time.
Yeah.
And there's no window.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so on the one hand, we can sort of poo-poo the fact that like, well, why are lighting manufacturers trying to sell these products instead of like doing it the right way with daylight? And the unfortunate reality is that like so much of our built environment is already constructed. And do we like just forego the fact that so many people are stuck in these environments? And try to sort of stand on our ivory tower that like, well, we should be providing good daylight architecture. Yes, we definitely should, but we also shouldn't leave these people stranded in these horribly poorly lit spaces. And so I do begrudgingly think that there is a place for electric lighting hardware that is specifically designed for circadian support, but it needs to be done, you know, holistically and in an appropriate manner. And
also really giving the consumer some education around that, because I feel like we are inadvertently saying, oh, well, this is enough. All you need is circadian lighting systems and you don't need to go outside.
Right.
When actually it needs to be done so well that we aren't causing any harm with misinforming the consumer.
Sure.
Because there's nothing to replace the outside environment, just the sheer magnitude of light that's available when you step outside of your home or office.
Well, it's totally magnitude, different. It's spectral power distribution. Yeah. I mean, when was the last time you sat under an electric light fixture that has wavelengths ranging from the far infrared into the ultraviolet?
Right. And that would be pretty unsafe. I wouldn't want to be around a light source that was doing that.
Turns out the sun can kill you too if you sit in it long enough.
That's true. And I've had that happen. I've made mistakes with the sun, but I always say there's nothing to replace darkness and there's nothing to replace the light of the sun.
Like the ideal is bright light during the day and dark light during the night.
Yeah, exactly. Daylighting is a very important counterpoint to darkness design. Now, with regards to darkness design, I've seen some great projects out of Lamp Partners. Do you have any particular favorites?
Well, I think probably the one that stands out the most is like a outdoor environment that we really tried to craft as a darkness forward cinematic experience.
I think I know which one.
It's a very challenging project. Emotionally is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This is a project we did with Mass Design Group in Montgomery, Alabama, and memorialized Black people that were lynched throughout the United States. I don't actually know what the boundaries of the years were in which they're counting, but the idea was that the memorial it has this continuous roof surface, and hanging from the roof are these steel modules, and every lynched person has their name etched into it. Wow. And each module represents a county. And so there's like 800 of these modules that are hanging from this roof. And so we came up with this lighting design scheme wherein, well, actually, wait, let me explain one other thing. When you walk into the memorial itself, you start at the ground level with the modules resting on the ground, and as you walk down a slope, and the modules stay at a consistent height, and you're lowering yourself. Your body is moving lower in relation to these elements that have sort of a similar relationship to the body. So we begin by uplighting each module individually, and keep in mind with the uplights, they're all captured. There's a roof over all of this. So it's not like we're just we're not lighting up into the sky.
Sure. Appreciate it.
Yes. And we'll get to some of the unfortunate consequences on some of this in a bit. But so we start with uplighting each module individually in the first part of the experience. And as you get down to a certain level, you're now well below the module head height. And at that point, we go from trying to count every one with a light source to basically lighting multiple from each fixture, sort of with the idea that like it gets so many that it's hard to count.
Yeah.
But we're trying.
Right. Wow.
And the original conception of the whole landscape here was that this is really the primary light source and that your eye adapts down. The truth is that the monument itself sits within a larger landscape, and we had to negotiate between wanting to try and keep a very subdued, low light level experience, and unfortunate realities about code requirements and egress and ADA and
it's always the trouble.
Yeah. That being said, what we did was inside there's an entry pavilion where you get your tickets, and then after you walk through there, you go up a shallow path going up, and all of the light sources are below eye height, so that there's no lighting in your field of view, ideally, above you. The truth is that this is not a project in the middle of nowhere. It's surrounded by city.
Yeah.
And
Which city is this in?
Montgomery, Alabama.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there are street lights. There are the city lights of downtown that sort of bleed into this. And so there's sort of this tension between trying to create a very dark, moody environment.
Which really showed in the photos. Like it jumped off the page when I was reviewing your work, and I did not know all of the background and how meaningful it is that you are bringing attention to what has often been not mentioned at all, and actually trying to quantify the harm that took place, I think is potentially very healing, although very heartbreaking.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really emotionally charged project to participate in. And I really give a strong commendation to Mass Design Group for the project.
Well, what struck me about the photos is just it is very dark. And so it's kind of interesting to hear your approach to light as you are using that, because the photos are very notably bringing in darkness. And I also think that darkness does an interesting thing in design, which is often employed in theatrical design, which is that darkness is sort of to create a veil to then invite the imagination in to sort of fill in the blanks. And I think that project from the photos is inviting the human imagination to sort of fill in the blanks of what this atrocity really was.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the benefit of it is that it's a controlled environment. Mm-hmm. It's an environment in which we could allow for those lower light levels. I will also say an unfortunate piece of it is that much of the time since it's opened, it has not been open at night.
Interesting.
And that's been for various reasons. But when the project first completed, it wasn't open, I think because they couldn't get a certificate of occupancy for nighttime use or something. And then when it did open, there were a whole bunch of articles that came out about people's experience with it at night. And it was really moving to see people having these, very personal and emotional experiences. And I think it's the kind of project that really there's a lot of success from that experience as a nighttime experience as opposed to daytime.
Yeah, well, I always am thinking about how when we are in the dark, we really are different people. It's a much more personal experience.
Yeah.
Everything kind of gets in a little closer. So I'm loving that you've brought the experience of darkness into a public space as much as you possibly could, because I think It's a counterpoint we're not taking in our minds and bodies.
Yeah.
We're kind of closing up now because we've been talking for a while, but what are you hoping to see for the industry trajectory of darkness design?
Less is more, man.
I agree.
I mean, mixed feelings on Mies van der Rohe, but that one definitely rings true here.
Yeah.
I think something I've really started to internalize, and this is across my practice, not just outdoor and darkness design, is, really focusing on making the best moves for a project and doing those really well, as opposed to doing as many as possible.
Yeah.
And that can be really important in an outdoor environment where more can have such a
Drastic.
massive impact.
Yeah.
I happen to be, I think this might be the first time in my career where I'm working on 5 or 6 outdoor nighttime environments for parks and landscapes all at once.
Wow.
And so it's giving me a good chance to drill in on ways to do this. And I think, honestly, it's both about, a sensitivity to appropriateness for hardware selections and location and placement, and thinking about, cohesion of light landscape, but also control, and how to convince clients that if they want to have more, that we need ways to pull that back.
Sure.
So that there can be a warm, welcoming environment for the early evening use when people are active and present, and then a way to pull that all back when it's beyond. But I think, one of the other things that I've been really trying to do is push back on clients that may have some control over lighting outside the purview of the project, but that will inevitably contribute to the experience of being in the site generally. So a great example is like a university where, we're redoing a pedestrian alley along a roadway that is currently a street, and they're turning it into a pedestrian only street. Mm-hmm. Well, the limits of our project are, at the limit of this street, but there's a whole bunch of not quite as bad as unshielded wall packs, but not much better than that.
Yeah.
On a couple of the buildings that are very visually present within this zone. And so really making a strong case to the university that yes, those are outside of the physical line of the boundary.
Sure.
According to the daytime use or according to the materials of the project. But the light
is impacting,
and the light is trespassing into the project. So let's consider those as part of the project. And, we've gotten good reception on a lot of that.
I'm glad you say that, because I often say that many lighting projects are treated as if there's going to be an apocalypse and the only project that's going to survive is the one you're working on.
Totally.
And what that does is it just ratchets up the light levels so that we're just it's always more than what we wanted.
It's literally how all codes are written too. I mean, think about egress code requirements. Why the hell do you need to put a light over a door that's right at the sidewalk when there's a street light right there?
Yeah.
Why do we have to externalize anything that's not in the project just because it's not in the project? It's not there. If it ends up not being there, fine. Then something can get added later.
Right.
But you shouldn't need to include, need to include light sources that are redundant. Exactly.
Yeah, and we're over engineering basically.
Exactly.
And to the detriment of all other living things.
Yeah.
So it's quite heartbreaking.
Especially when it's an unshielded wall pack.
Yes, nice to bring it back. And so actually I want to just ask you before we close out, How do you bring darkness into your own life? And
Ooh.
yeah.
Well, our nightly rituals are, I think, well tuned, and I make a strong commitment to the gradual reduction of light in our home every night. We live in a first floor and basement condo, so we actually don't get great daylight, unfortunately, in our space. But I've obviously gone to the nines with my electric lighting for obvious reasons. But there are some, built-in downlights in the space, and then I have a whole range of fixtures tucked into various nooks and crannies. First thing to go is the downlights.
Yeah.
After dinner's over, we definitely take those out, start bring everybody's adaptation levels down.
Love that.
When it's time for bed, we'll turn out all the lights in the living and dining rooms and retreat to the bedrooms, where I've got a series of Philips Hue lamps that are tucked into corners. So no overhead light, or in the TikTok sensation, no big light, as I recently learned.
Yes.
And for my kids, they each have a reading lamp. My son likes to read every night, and he keeps it on the 2200K
Nice.
setting when he's reading at night. And even though getting him to turn off the light and close up his book is tough, he finally got into Harry Potter, which I'm not a fan of, but my wife is strongly in favor of, and he's just blasting through those right now.
That's awesome.
My wife and I will often watch one show on our laptop in bed with a comfortable blue and red low-level lighting scheme for the bedroom while we're watching TV. And then after we're done, every night...
Blue and red? What's the blue and red?
Well, it's just like it's at such a low light level.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not
low
worried
intensity.
about it. Yeah.
I got you.
It's like, lighting behind like my dresser.
Sure.
We're not like I'm not like staring into
like
circadian level blue lighting here.
Yeah.
And then every night after we turn out the lights, I use a heated eye mask for about a half an hour, and sometimes I'll listen to a podcast while I'm doing that, and I heat my eyes. I have a recurring blepharitis, which is a lot of people have it. It's your eyes start to dry up, and the oil glands start to excrete less oil as you age.
Actually, I do have that.
You probably have it.
Sucks.
And I will tell you, after going to see a doctor about some eye issues, and he suggested this, it is like crack, man. It feels incredible.
I'm going to do this. That's awesome.
So not only I'm as a eye mask, but also like it's heating. But this also reminds me that something that I've done from an early age, because I went to summer camp for a long time, is I have kind of a weird sleeping habit where for many years I always put a pillow over my head to block out light because of like the dickish kids I was at summer camp with who would like to like flick on the lights after the counselors left. And then it transitioned to just using a towel. So I actually sleep every night with a towel over my head because I don't like the feeling of sleeping with an eye mask.
Okay.
And that blocks out all the light, any stray light.
Wow.
And we keep a very, very dark room with blackout shades and only a couple, our clocks.
Yeah. Well, there's stray light coming from almost every device.
Yeah.
But that's awesome. I'm definitely going to take up the eye mask tip.
Yeah.
And I will say that in my life, what I do is at dusk, I do not turn the lights on. And I let the sky fully fall to dark before I do turn the lights on.
Interesting.
I call it dusk reverie. I remember my cousins came back around that time, and they were like, "Why are you in the dark?" Because they had come from brighter lights, so it seemed much darker.
Sure.
But psychologically, for me, it's just become so important to see that transition, and it really does feel like something I miss. I got home from a trip last week after dusk, and I felt like I was like, like, what do I do with this night? You know, it felt kind of awkward.
Yeah, you like missed it.
Yeah, I felt if I had come at dusk, I would have felt like I had the night, but I was like late to the night.
Funny.
So
At our office, if I don't turn on the light, my lights around my cubicle, it gets very dark where I sit.
I can see that.
You know, I will admit that I work on 3 large screens, monitors, so it's a little too much contrast if I don't
get
turn
that.
on.
I hate that feeling, actually, that tunnel vision of the screen. Yeah.
But the light that I do turn on is low level and just helps balance out those contrast ratios a little.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah.
But I very much appreciate that. That's very cool.
Yeah, it's better when you don't have to work in front of a screen, which
Absolutely.
I've had that too, where I'm like, do I want the dusk? But I can't really enjoy it anyway because of the screen.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Such a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's been great. So thank you so much. And we'll catch up again soon.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And thanks to Dan for a great conversation. Fun fact, Dan was actually my TA in my first lighting class back in grad school way back when. Special thanks to Lydia Weissman for producing this episode, and to Sibel Policastro for editing this episode. I'm also excited to share with you that I'll be releasing my first Midnight Meditation album in the next couple weeks, On Luck. This is a lullaby for adults, a meditation flight of 3 nights, and I can't wait to share. Please stay tuned.